Hey guys, this here is going to be a two-parter story, with part 1 being done by myself, and part 2 being done by Artificial DM. So, after this video is over, go and watch part 2 over on DM's channel. But, without further ado, let's get into it. This was years and years ago, when LiveJournal was a relevant thing and RP communities were fairly commonplace on that platform. Not the typical sort of role-playing game that frequently gets discussed in the subreddit, but a play-by-post game which required fairly minimal GM involvement. The game in question was one of those big pan-fandom games that you would sometimes see, with players taking on roles of characters from books, movies, comics, games, and other such things, and throwing them together in a single setting. Not my usual sort of game, either then or now, but the premise seemed interesting to me. The characters were duped into taking a trip with promises of their fondest wishes being granted, only to find themselves trapped in a desolate and inescapable British castle and its surrounding estate, and investigating the mystery of what brought them together from their disparate worlds and how to escape whilst interacting with these extreme and outlandish people from other realities. It was fertile ground for some interesting role-playing premises, and at that time that I joined the game, little did I realize that it had just undergone something of a collapse in its player base. Many of the long-term players had left after a huge personal conflict with the GM, whom for reasons, which will become clear later, I will call Camel. I was never 100% clear on the details of this falling out, but in retrospect, nothing about it surprises me. Suffice it to say that Camel was a difficult person to get along with, and a large number of players had collectively decided that they were done with their crap. Nevertheless, I found myself greatly enjoying playing with the other players in the group who remained active, and became deeply invested in the game. However, over the course of these first several months, Camel gradually went completely silent, not responding to any messages, and essentially abandoning the game. By the nature of the game, this wasn't necessarily a death sentence. The players were free to continue to roleplay amongst themselves. It just meant that no new plot elements would be introduced for us to interact with. In this time, I started both regularly playing and talking with a player whom I'll call Chihuahua. Our talk became increasingly flirtatious and eventually romantic, and in our talks, she revealed a bunch of stuff to me that shed some light on all of this. She and Camel were roommates, and apparently Camel had just grown so dissolute over the departure of all the players that she actually cared about in the game that she no longer felt any investment in it. I suggested to her that perhaps she could ask her roommate if the two of us could be given some sort of co-GM authority to just kind of move things along and keep the game running. She agreed and secured this permission, and we managed to get things moving again. Over the course of the next few months, we managed to recruit a whole bunch of new players and get numerous new plots going. Camel was completely checked out. Chihuahua and I agreed that what would be best for the game would be if she were to formally resign and hand it over to the two of us. But, due to her ego, it was unlikely that she would ever do so. Eventually, I made a trip to see Chihuahua in person, down in the southern US, for a 2-week vacation. I won't go into personal details of that visit, but there are some details which are germane to the game, and by extension, this story. The two of them, and a third roommate who plays no relevant role in this story, lived in this bizarre little hovel, way out in the middle of the desert. And it was filthy in ways which are hard to encapsulate. The most memorable detail was the washroom mirror. Imagine if every time you brushed your teeth, you then spat out the frothy mix of saliva and toothpaste directly into the mirror itself, and then just never cleaned it, and nor did your roommates. It just became this sedimentary formation of dried toothpaste spit piled upon itself, obscuring your reflection. And then extend this level of squalor to every other aspect of the home, and you should be able to form a coherent mental image of the place. The squalor was made even stranger for the fact that, in addition to 5 or something dogs, Camel owned a lot of exotic pets, some of which I believe are illegal to own in the US. Amongst them were an emu and a pair of camels. Apparently, she was from some old money family and just received this hefty monthly allowance which she spent almost exclusively on these exotic animals, and basically none of it on home upkeep. Evidently, she'd basically just never worked a day in her life, and this was just her thing. In the first several days that I was there, she never once made herself seen or known, just keeping to her bedroom 100% of the time. It wasn't until about a week into the trip during a night, when we went into the city for dinner, that she joined us for the outing, and I got to meet her. All things considered, it was a surprisingly cordial meeting, and we actually had some pretty fruitful and productive discussions about things which could be done with the game, which left me feeling pretty invigorated about the whole matter. By the time I went home, it was clear that the romantic aspect of my relationship with Chihuahua just wasn't going to work out. Sometimes what works online doesn't necessarily translate into in-real-life chemistry. It happens. Again, no need to go into details, but we ended things on what seemed, at the time, like amiable terms. Immediately upon my return home, we kicked off a big meta-plot development in the game involving every player, and splitting off into 3 big threads which would propel the game's long-stagnant plot forward in a bunch of exciting new ways. Chihuahua insisted on having one character in each of these threads, which she had been writing in order to keep things moving along. This would soon prove to be ironic, as she quickly lost interest in all of them and went silent. Even with gentle prodding by the various players, she couldn't be coaxed into any participation in any of them for weeks, and then months. Other things were happening in the game in the meantime. I was using my assistant GM status to give the players plenty to play with, to keep things bouncing along and interesting. And as Chihuahua disappeared entirely from the game as Camel had before her, I maintained the game's public chat room, keeping the community engaged and social, moving things along as best as I could. There was considerable sourness amongst the players towards both Camel and Chihuahua, who were seen as holding back the game's progress, and the ability of the other players to get anywhere with the main plot of the game, but we were still all having fun with one another. And by this time, there were dozens of players in the game, most of whom had never had any interactions with Camel at all, and only knew Chihuahua as that other co-GM who never does anything and is holding everything up. So, imagine everyone's surprise when, after the better part of a year of silence, Camel put out an admin post notifying everyone that I was being stripped of my position and authority, and that she was resuming full control of the game, without having had any communication with me about it ahead of time. Well guys, that's going to be the end of part 1, so make sure you go check DM's video for part 2 and the conclusion to the story. But I have to say, I thought with them having met and Camel agreeing to give them code DM status and whatnot, that Camel was in fact not going to be the issue. I was starting to think it might have been Chihuahua, considering that they too flaked out. But the descriptor of the mirror and this person's spending habits really kind of reminds me of the age-old story of the Final Fantasy house. I can only imagine what kind of pigsty that place they were living in is, or was, and I think it probably gives a good idea as to why the relationship between the OP and Chihuahua didn't quite work out. But that's the end of this one. Hopefully you enjoyed and enjoy part 2, and, as always, have a good one.